Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I appreciate your time today for what is our third Transatlantic Privacy Dialogue. We'll explain in a moment what that is. First, my name is Christian Dawson, and I'm Executive Director of the Internet Infrastructure Coalition. We are sometimes called I2 Coalition. We have panelists that are going to talk about in detail what it is we are discussing today. I don't want to jump in on their territory too much, but I want to talk a little bit about I2 Coalition and our sister organization that we are doing this series of events with. This is our third and final event for this go-round in the conversations that we're having around the world. I2 Coalition is a trade association made up of the people that build the infrastructure of the internet. That is the component of the internet that sits above the telco layer and below all of the content the websites that you use on a daily basis. They are the people that provide the web hosting, the data center operations, the domain name services, the streaming services, the virtual private network services, all of the different computer operations that happen in that middle ground that actually make the internet function. And our job at the Internet Infrastructure Coalition is to be a voice for all those companies and to make sure that legislators, regulators, and whoever else needs to know it understands the economic importance of what it is we do as a community. Moreover, that they understand that this is a group of businesses that's predominantly made up of small to medium businesses. And so when you're talking about how the internet needs to evolve, how regulations need to change, you need to take into account the needs of those businesses that really make up the heart of the internet, which ultimately fuels the entire digital economy. And these days, the digital economy is pretty much the economy. So we hope that our message is extremely important, and we're glad to be able to provide it to you today. One of our closest partners in taking our message around the world are our friends at the ECHO Association, who do what we do over in Europe. We have worked with the ECHO Association on a series of important projects. We've been working together, I guess, for 5 or 6 years now. We have worked together on projects to expand the multilingual internet in a project that one of our panelists, Ram Mohan, who you'll hear from in a little bit, has helped drive. We have done work on the IANA transition, an important component of how the multi-stakeholder mode of internet governance has evolved over time. We worked very closely on that. And transatlantic privacy and how it impacts global trade is another area in which we are collaborating to ensure that that what happens moving forward in this arena happens in a way that benefits our European counterparts and ourselves appropriately and takes the needs of the internet's infrastructure into account. So I'm very pleased that we have our partners here joining us in Washington after they have graciously had us at events that were similar to this one in Brussels and in Berlin. We are taking this conversation, we've taken this conversation global in order to make sure that we are getting the word out about what our community needs. So what I think I'd like to do is I think that in order to illuminate exactly what it is we are talking about today and what the subject of our panel is in today's program, I would like to invite Oliver Sume from the ECHO Association to join us and to lay out today's program. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you so much, Christian, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for us to be here, and we are very grateful for the fruitful cooperation with the I2 Coalition. And we are absolutely convinced that not only in terms of international data transfer, but also in general, in terms of the digital economy, it's key to have this transatlantic cooperation. The digital economy is dependent on each other on both sides of the Atlantic. And the topic that we're going to discuss here today, the privacy shield and questions around the legal requirements for international data transfer, is one of the most important aspects that we see in order to grow this digital economy on both sides of the Atlantic. The ECO Association is one of the oldest associations that we have in Europe in terms of ICT trade associations. We were founded in 1995. We are currently counting around 1,100 members from many countries in the world, not only Germany, not only Europe, but I think between 40 and 50 countries outside Europe. And there is a reason for that, because we are operating with one of our 100% affiliate, one of the most important internet infrastructure operations, the so-called DKIX, which is the most important internet exchange platform in terms of traffic. We're operating these platforms in many countries in the world. We have one affiliate also here in New York, very close to here, which is very successful. I think alone 200 networks are connected at the New York platform. And that is the reason why, from the very beginning of establishing our association, well, we have been a truly international internet association, and data and the exchange of data is kind of part of our DNA. That's why the international transfer of data is so important for us. To give you a little bit of an idea what is happening currently in terms of the development of the European economy, I would like to give you some numbers. You will be aware of the fact that a large number of big and medium-sized European companies are already clients to many US cloud providers of all kinds of services. Software as a service, platform as a service, everything goes into the cloud. That's where everyone sees the future. And we are currently in a situation where more and more parts of almost every sector in the European economy is going digital, which means they have to rely on services like the one that not only, but many US providers are offering to them. And that means that they have to exchange data. That's part of this business and of the services. And they, of course, need legal certainty to do so. That's why we think that the Privacy Shield is a very important discussion, and that legal certainty in terms of international data transfer is one of the key conditions to further grow the digitization of the European and probably also the US economy. I think it's important to note that we think we're at the very beginning of this process. Nowadays, the big companies, or at least the bigger ones, are the clients to US cloud providers. If you look at the European structure of the economy, you might be aware of the fact that the majority of companies are small and medium-sized companies. And those companies are at the very beginning of going into the cloud, of digitization in their business processes. So there are huge opportunities for US providers, which all the more means that we need legal certainty for this. We have, from 100 companies in Europe, 99 companies are small and medium-sized companies. They account for approximately 80% of Europe's employment. And in terms of value, they generate 57 cents of every €1 added value in Europe. That means it's a huge part. It's what we say the backbone of the European economy. And all these companies are, well, future clients maybe. They are only in the very beginning to start to grow their business, to go into the cloud, to transform their business and their processes into the digital world. And that's why we think it's so important to have legal certainty for international data transfer. I think this is a very great opportunity to discuss the impact, the conditions, and the political environment that we're in these important questions. And I'm really looking forward to our panel here today. Thank you very much.
And now we will have Andrew Steele give us a briefing on the status of Privacy Shield is. How would you like to turn the briefing? The status of Privacy Shield as it stands today?
Yes, that's fine.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Christian, for the introduction, and thank you, Oliver. Very happy to be here. My name is Andrew Steele. I'm with the Department of Commerce in the Office of Digital Services Industries, and so I'm a policy advisor and administrator of the Privacy Shield program. I'm sitting here on the panel because I consider these few minutes that I'll be speaking sort of preparatory remarks before the panel gets started. And of course, some of the questions that I may provoke in my remarks, happy to discuss in the panel and so forth. But because of Privacy Shield being such a focal point for many of us, I thought it'd be helpful if I just sort of laid out some of the key issues as I see them today. So Privacy Shield, of course, as many of you know, began in 2016. And as of today, we have over 4,600 US organizations who are self-certified and participating in the EU-US Privacy Shield program alongside the Swiss-US Privacy Shield program. The number of participants continues to grow well into its third year. Last year, in October, we had the second annual review of the program. This was held in Brussels. The first annual review was in Washington in 2017. We're very happy and pleased to see that after the second annual review, both the European Commission and the European Data Protection Board both issued reports that concluded the framework continues to ensure an adequate level of protection for personal data transferred from the European Union to the United States. We are pleased that the reports also recognize the hard work that the department's efforts to enhance the Privacy Shield program and address issues raised during the first annual review in 2017. Speaking more to recent news, I can confirm that once confirmed by the Senate, the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy and Environment, Keith Crotch, will serve as the Privacy Shield ombudsperson. In that role, he will oversee the processing of requests from the EU and Swiss individuals relating to U.S. government access to data transmitted from the European Union or Switzerland to the United States. And that has been an ongoing point of concern for many. The administration has and will continue to stand firmly behind the Privacy Shield, recognizing the benefits it brings to data protection and our economies. Its success means a greater number of companies have made enforceable commitments on protecting personal data from the EU, and extended recourse mechanisms to EU individuals, and also that a greater number of US and EU companies have access to the tools they need to do business together. The Privacy Shield stands as a testament to that trust in the way a company collects and processes data is imperative to customers, and certifications demonstrating such compliance have tangible value to regulators and industry. Now I'll touch on both the Privacy Shield administration as it currently stands and its relationship to the General Data Protection Regulation, which of course speaks to the broader transatlantic digital relationship. The United States government has worked closely with our EU partners for many years now on Privacy Shield because we recognize the importance of a well-functioning, trusted, and enforceable framework for cross-border data protection. The Privacy Shield team at the Department of Commerce administers and supports the program with our own focus team and team leader who are dedicated exclusively to our efforts. The team works with organizations to verify that all certification requirements are met before the certifications are finalized and public claims of participation are made. Due to the rigor of the process, not all companies meet the certification criteria. We have developed guidance for Privacy Shield self-certification at our website, privacyshield.gov. Guidance and how-to guides on the website are available for download to any interested party. The Privacy Shield team initiates regular compliance monitoring of Privacy Shield certified companies and proactive searches for false claims by organizations that have not, in fact, certified. To monitor ongoing compliance with the program, our team instituted a new process to randomly select and conduct spot checks of Privacy Shield participants. Apart from this, we also actively monitor news sources for reports regarding the privacy practices of Privacy Shield participants. The team sends formal questionnaires to participant organizations if their compliance review or news monitoring reveals credible evidence of non-compliance. While a company's decision to self-certify is voluntary, once it self-certifies and publicly commits to the Privacy Shield, its commitments are enforceable under U.S. law by either the Federal Trade Commission or the U.S. Department of Transportation, depending on which entity has jurisdiction. Referrals of false claims of participation made by the United States Department of Commerce to the FTC have resulted in FTC settlements. These settlement agreements mean that these companies are prohibited from misrepresenting their participation in Privacy Shield. Those companies are also required to fulfill FTC's reporting and compliance requirements. We've also worked to expand public awareness of the Privacy Shield program through participation in events like this today, reaching out to U.S. businesses and the international business community. This has included roadshows across the United States to 19 U.S. cities, where we met with more than 200 U.S. companies and more than 20 webinars that are uploaded by many of our Privacy Shield independent recourse mechanism organizations. Now, finally, just before we go to the panel, I wanted to touch on GDPR and its relationship. Of course, Privacy Shield began prior to the implementation of GDPR on May 25th, 2018, but Privacy Shield, negotiated by our two governments in 2016, was designed with an eye to GDPR, addressing both substantive and the procedural elements of the new law. GDPR provides for the continuity of prior EU Commission adequacy determinations, and that includes Privacy Shield. The Privacy Shield annual reviews are an exercise in the Privacy Shield framework, which calls for those adequacy reviews to be completed every single year. Substantially, the Privacy Shield is designed to bridge the gap between our two systems. While the requirements under Privacy Shield and GDPR are not identical, the Commission has found that the principles of Privacy Shield ensure a level of protection that is essentially equivalent to the requirements of EU law. Given that essential equivalence, they align closely. That said, Privacy Shield is not a GDPR certification mechanism. It simply allows companies to comply with the data transfer provisions under Chapter 5 of GDPR. We will continue to share this information with U.S. organizations and the international business community writ large to help U.S. organizations within scope of the new rule to maintain market access, promote their innovation, and support the Transatlantic partnership. And I think with that, I'll leave it to the community discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for that briefing. Appreciate it. I welcome the rest of our panelists to join us as I turn over, and come sit, as I turn over the program to I2 Coalition Board Chair Frank Stiff to begin our panel deliberation today. So thank you, Frank, for taking over.
Thank you all for coming this afternoon. My name is Frank Stiff. I am board chair of the I2 Coalition. I also am an investment banker providing financial services to internet services companies. I'm going to give just a little bit of the brief background of our panel, then we'll jump right in. Everybody here has quite robust bios. If you have an interest, I encourage you to go online and look up more detail. To my right is David Sneed. David is General Counsel of cPanel. He's also Chair of the Policy Committee for the I2 Coalition. He is responsible for cPanel's global legal operations, and he's a part of their management team. In 2011, David and Christian Dawson founded the Internet Infrastructure Coalition. Some of the first members quickly changed the name to I2 Coalition. So it would be possible for somebody to type in the URL and find us. And it is an advocacy organization for internet infrastructure industry. Oliver Soumet, I think we've already got the background on, Chairman of ECHO. He's also a partner at the large European law firm of Field Fisher. Ram Mohan is COO of Affilius. He was a co-founder of Affilius in July 2001 as CTO. And I don't know how many of you all know, but Affilius owns a number of TLDs like .info and .mobi. They are also the service provider to hundreds of other TLDs across the world, and they have offices all around the world. He's got 20 years plus experience in leadership and entrepreneurship in the sector. I think Andrew's background and then Ned is Chief of Staff for Chairman Elliot Engel. Chairman Engel is Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he also sits on the Energy and Commerce. Ned has been on the Hill since 1981, largely as either a Chief of Staff or a Legislative Director for a number of congressmen, and I think he's probably seen it all, judging from the... And last but not least is Melissa Froelich, who is Chief Counsel for the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce. Melissa has been legal counsel to the Energy and Commerce Committee for some time in various capacities. And listen, thank you all very much for joining us. Perhaps as a first start is that obviously Privacy Shield exists because the privacy laws in the US and EU are different. Perhaps Andrew and Oliver, could you all comment as to why are the privacy laws different? Are there structural reasons or an ethos reason for the differences, the fundamental differences?
I would say there are cultural differences with regard to how to deal with privacy and data protection, and already the fact that we have these two different terms shows that there seems to be a different understanding about what privacy is in the US and what we understand as data protection in Europe. And I think one of the most impressive examples is if you look at the definition about data protection in the GDPR, then you will see that this is a very, very broad definition, and almost any kind of information can be considered personal information, personal data under certain circumstances. And I know that one example is always very good to surprise people, that even an IP address under the GDPR or under European data protection law can be considered as personal data, which means you fall into the scope of the GDPR. That's it's about data, it's about the information, and it's not only related to your private, environment or privacy in general. I think it's much more detailed, and that's why I think we have a different approach here.
Thank you. I would just add to that, of course, speaking not only to the cultural commonalities that there exists across the Atlantic, but there are structural or regulatory differences. And I think part of that is, as the digital economy has developed, there's a body of law that already serves or can be applied to this area. So in the United States, ours is a sectoral process. And so starting in the 1970s, we have privacy laws that are on the books. And so HIPAA regulations for the healthcare space. We have different regulations for education, for nonprofits. The Federal Trade Commission is one of the strongest global privacy enforcement actors in the world, and they're going to base their actions on unfair or abusive or deceptive business practices. And so they're the affirmative statements that Privacy Shield organizations are making, publicly providing that notice, is what provides that obligation and ensures the adequacy of the Privacy Shield as a transfer mechanism under GDPR. So while we have, I think, very similar cultural foundations and social norms, the legal systems are quite different as they currently exist. But I do push back a little bit on some of the focus on having a single comprehensive privacy law, because there already exists robust privacy rules here in the United States today.
So I guess the other topic I'd love to cover before we kind of jump in is why do we care? What's the business case? And David, maybe you and Ram could comment on why we really care about the international data flows.
Well, there are a couple of things that are fairly straightforward, right? If you're a business and you have to deal with different privacy regimes from around the world and you have to implement for that, there is a significant burden, a significant cost associated with it. And as a business, one of the biggest things you got to think about is what is a benefit? And our consumers are the people who are actually supposed to benefit from it being benefited. That's one thing. The other part of it is to make sure that the privacy element does not overshadow the security element or vice versa. There has to be some level of a balance. You know, you look at affiliates and look at what we do with domain names, for example. There's a lot of data about who owns a domain name, and that information has traditionally been a public thing. With GDPR, that is going under different shields. And the question is, if you're in law enforcement and you have a site that you think has real problem, and you want to find out who is the owner of that site, can you do it directly, easily by just looking up a database, or is this something that you need to go and jump through a few extra hoops? And are those hoops going to work just inside of your country? How do you deal with those hoops when the party that is hosting the information is in a completely different jurisdiction than the party that is there? So, I mean, my hope is that we get to a set of common norms and common rules about how to deal with privacy and with security, rather than looking for yet more regulation and yet more rules. Because especially with the way the internet is and how fast this is moving, by the time you get the rules done, you know, it's kind of obsolete.
So I think that that is a good way for me to segue into kind of why Privacy Shield is important to our businesses, and I'm very a firm believer in providing kind of statistics and metrics about to help understand why business decisions are important. For cPanel, I kind of have two hats on today. For cPanel, we have more partners and distributors in the EU than we have in any other jurisdiction. We have a substantial amount of our revenue comes from the EU, and so Privacy Shield is critical for us to demonstrate a commitment to our customers. Privacy Shield allows our customers to comply with EU regulations and continue to purchase and license products from us. So from a business perspective, it makes business sense for us to be Privacy Shield certified, and that's why Privacy Shield is just really is very important to our business. Privacy and issues, our programs like Privacy Shield help us demonstrate a commitment to our customers that we take their information seriously, that we are custodians of information that they might send us. So it helps us become closer to our customers themselves. It helps us show that we understand that our customers who are not based in the U.S. have to comply with laws outside the U.S. There often seems to be an awareness among U.S. companies that our customers have to comply with the laws where they're located. We can't just say to them, you have to comply with U.S. laws because we're based in the U.S. So Privacy Shield helps us demonstrate to our EU customers that we take their laws seriously. Putting on my I2 Coalition hat, it is incredibly important to our members. Again, using cPanel as an example, cPanel is owned by a holding company that's based in Europe. So this holding company has offices in the US, in the EU, and in Russia. And so understanding how data flows is very important to our company, and the way that the I2 Coalition and ECHO help support an understanding of the importance of regulation around data flows is really critical to us. And the final thing that it does is it really helps underscore compliance issues in general. I think that there is, for some internet companies, a lack of appreciation of the need to comply for regulatory compliance, and that's another thing that it does for us.
Thanks, David. And for those of you that aren't aware, cPanel is a software provider of server management software and billing software that is ubiquitous across the internet infrastructure business. So kind of jumping off into the larger topic of privacy, perhaps I'll throw this to the end of the table. Do we see, or do you all see privacy legislation coming together, and if so, by what day?
It's an important issue to a number of members of Congress because they hear from their constituents, and more data breaches, more selling of their information gets members of Congress' attention. It was not on the initial agenda for the committee chairman, Frank Pallone, but it doesn't mean that members of Congress are not going to move out, hold hearings, write some legislation, and I think press for a vote, just because members of Congress are reactive, and the constituents who are most interested in this are going to be politically active. They're going to be getting in front of the Congress people, saying, "What are you doing on this?" And the message that members of Congress continue to receive is self-regulation is not working. It's been a failure. And I think with the European moving to have stronger regulation and laws puts an added amount of pressure on members here to at least begin the process of trying to move some legislation in response.
So what I would add from the energy and commerce perspective for the minority is this conversation has obviously been ongoing for quite some time, and in terms of the privacy shield, that's been an ongoing conversation, an important mechanism to have a conversation about the transatlantic dialogue and the importance of that massive, over $1 trillion relationship, and understanding what that takes when you have some fundamental differences, to an earlier point that was made about the structural differences between the constitutional foundations here in the United States with the First and the Fourth Amendment, and a lot of the privacy pieces that come along with some differences just in terms of jurisdiction in the EU over some of the capacities in which GDPR is going to handle data and manage those things. I would say in terms of what I would suggest for folks in this room, if this is an important issue for you, I would suggest continuing to reach out to members and expressing where you are in the ecosystem. I think one of the things that we've continually heard, and I've had wonderful opportunities to visit with a lot of our EU counterparts and some of the DPAs from other member states, as well as folks within different state attorney general's offices here in the United States. There's a lot of focus on the big tech companies, and I think that there's a lot of value in hearing from the rest of the ecosystem that underpins all the other ways that traditional commerce is now leveraging the internet, and understanding what that means, and not just what Facebook, and to be clear, Facebook owns Instagram, which I think some folks forget, what some of these other tech platforms are doing, and how that relates to the rest of the economy that I think, depending upon the discussion that you're having, could or could not be included in how Congress addresses this issue. So I agree there's a lot of interest. I would actually say that the California law has created a little bit more emphasis here in Congress than the 10 years of debate around GDPR and its implementation, at least from the meetings that we've taken with folks. So that's certainly been a focus from our office, is not just on GDPR, but also what's happening here at home. And that's why my boss and Mr. Walden and Mrs. Rogers have put out some policy principles and things that they're really focused on as we get into the weeds on this issue, that there should be one national standard. How the internet operates here within the U.S. and internationally requires some attention to what it would mean to small businesses, medium-sized businesses, if there were to be a patchwork of different state laws, that we can improve transparency and accountability for folks within our system, and that data security is a really important component of the conversation. Verification seems to be a key component of both GDPR and the California law, and when you think about data collection practices required for verification, you get to a very, very important security conversation pretty quickly. And then the last point that they raise and talk a lot about and care a lot about is the impact of any regulation on small businesses and innovation. We've seen the data coming out of some different institutions measuring GDPR, and we're only a year in, so I think there's a lot more data to be held, and we understand that a lot of those studies will be ongoing. But when you look at the venture capital numbers here in the U.S., those are important parts of the economy, like I said, that are outside of the big three tech firms, or FANG, or however you want to define the headline grabbers. But how the small business community is impacted in innovation in the U.S. is going to be a really big factor for our members.
Yeah, just thank you. I think that's very, very eloquent and well put. The Department of Commerce certainly echoes that, and at the executive branch, we are doing the same sort of facilitation of outreach. In the fall, NTIA put out a request for input that would be leaning towards the executive branch's greater understanding of how comprehensive privacy legislation may or may not facilitate some of the needs that we need in the policy space. NIST, the National Information Institute of Standards and Technology, excuse me, they have their own privacy framework that they are beginning to do workshops on. So I encourage you all to check their website. They just had their second workshop. A third is planned for the summer. So their stakeholder input is critical, because we're at that point now where we're trying to listen to private sector, the business community, but also the civil society and private individuals. And so it's not just the largest companies, as Melissa mentioned. And so when hundreds of companies submit those comments running up and down the gamut, Privacy Shield is majority small and medium enterprises. Privacy Shield is majority companies who do not define themselves as in the ICT sector. So this is very broad. The internet economy is the economy.
So I'll just make a comment here from the I2 Coalition perspective and the policy perspective of the I2 Coalition. There are a number of principles that we support for privacy legislation, some of which you mentioned, but I have four. The privacy legislation needs to be practical. It needs to ensure accountability. Reporting there needs to be some reporting, so to evaluate whether the legislation is effective or not. And the final thing is it needs to be system-wide. So meaning, like HIPAA, it needs to include privacy throughout the ecosystem. So it can't just be internet companies. The privacy legislation can't be internet company specific, because that will not be effective privacy legislation. And let me just drill down into a couple of those, like practicality. I think we all can agree that privacy notices have become way too complicated. And so it needs to be something, the notices that go out need to be something that can be parsed by a human, not just by a lawyer. And in terms of the way it's implemented, and this next piece, I'll give an example from my work at cPanel, but in the way that it's implemented, there can't be a requirement for automation. And what I mean by that is there are provisions in GDPR that require you to take out information when someone requests that their information be removed. There are folks who believe that that requires that be automated, which is not the case under GDPR. And we have a concern that there might be pieces of legislation that require some sort of automation, when the reality is it's very expensive for us to build tools, automation tools. So for GDPR purposes, cPanel does not have that much personal information. We can delete email, we can delete personal information simply when we receive an email. So we don't want automation required in the legislation. And I do want to just emphasize again that it's important that the legislation apply, or any law apply, to everyone who's processing information in the entire chain and not just to internet companies. So that's kind of the I2 Coalition perspective on this.
Terrific, thanks very much. Ron.
Thank you. One of the interesting things that has happened in the technology space is the development of certain types of technology that already allow for the ease of distribution of the information, as well as the ability to filter information data based on various profiles. There's as in all things tech, there is an acronym for it. It's called RDAP, the Registration Data Access Protocol. But the short form of it is that it's a well-established, well-known technology that allows for any company that is sitting on data to be able to provide as much or as little data as needed in a way that is dependent upon configurable profiles. So think of it as starting up your Microsoft Word and deciding that you want to have font A or font B, size A or size B come up. You don't have to start and require automation for all of that. You just take it and you configure it. So that kind of a technology exists. In fact, I just recently finished chairing a global panel that worked on a technological framework that is open source, made available to all, that actually allows for the dissemination, the access as well as dissemination of private data without actually requiring a law to be put in place to make such a thing happen. Right? So those technologies exist today, the mechanisms exist. So again, I'd hope that our policymakers not only look at the impact on the businesses that are directly affected, but also look at the fact that technology is evolving pretty quickly. Protocols and systems already exist to implement and potentially to even harmonize across multiple jurisdictions.
Terrific, thanks. Just going back a second, Melissa, you commented about a focus on the ecosystem, whether the ecosystem, the business, how the business was going to react to the privacy rules people are working on. Do you think that's widespread? Is that just you guys in your office, or do you think that's a widespread across Congress focus?
Oh, goodness. So I think we've certainly seen in the Senate, it's caught in fire across several committees, which always makes this interesting and a challenge. No, I think there's a lot of interest within the House as well. I do think that it's always fascinating to go back, and they're analogous only insofar as it's very hard to talk about what we've seen in the public eye over the last, say 5 years, in the larger context of a 20-year-long debate around things like data breach notification, data security, and where different pieces of industry have played in those debates, and why it's been so challenging. To an earlier point that was made, that if you are so prescriptive, a law can be out of date the minute that it's, before it's signed, really. And it's a very challenging place where on a bipartisan basis, on some partisan bases, folks have really been trying to push different pieces of legislation for a very long time, and those inter-industry conflicts are very real. And so taking the input at an early stage and creating that buy-in, and I think that's what's so interesting about this moment in time. Not that it's any easier, but it seems that there's some incentive on the business community side based on both from the larger businesses and the international business perspective, seeing GDPR, but also here in the home front, seeing, California, you had the Washington bill that made its way fairly far through the process. I think there's, somewhere under 10 states that are evaluating. I think at one point there were 90 different proposals at the state level. There's a serious risk there in terms of compliance and exposure to risk that hasn't necessarily existed in the same way as data security and data breach notification, which can be a little bit more narrow and defined in some contexts. And that to me is instructive, where if we can find a path forward where industry, it seems that putting pen to paper and the efforts that our committee engaged in and really soliciting feedback from folks, other committees have engaged in, the work that NTIA and the Department of Commerce are doing to get comments and having folks put pen to paper about what they're doing, what's actually out there in the industry is really instructive. And they're all kind of small steps forward, but I think that that's what it's going to take to get to a place where you could actually get something through both chambers, which is a pretty heavy lift.
Sure.
Maybe it's helpful for the discussion and maybe even for any legislative process in terms of new privacy regulation to talk a little bit about the first experiences that we have in Europe. Now that it's almost 1 year ago that the GDPR came into effect. I think it turned out that, that's not a secret, that this caused really a lot of work and a lot of complex challenges for almost every company, not only in Europe, But as we all know, due to the territorial scope, also for many companies from the US and other jurisdictions. And I think one of the key learnings is that the GDPR does not provide for enough flexibility and not enough exemptions. It caused a lot of confusion with almost every business because there is no difference between a technology company that has to process personal data as part of their core business model and let's say a kindergarten or a church that is collecting money from people. And that really lead to some weird situations in Europe. In particular, small and medium-sized companies have been extremely confused about what they have to do to be compliant or not. And now that we are close to the first birthday of the GDPR, you see reviews and many, many reports in newspapers about the most craziest developments that we have seen in the last year. And just to give you some examples, some supermarkets thought they have to provide information about how they deal with personal data in their shopping windows. Churches have privacy notices on their blackboards when people are going to church. I mean, that's not the rule, but it shows that this piece of regulation caused a lot of confusion. I would say, in general, it's a milestone, and it's a big achievement. And I think it's really the biggest achievement in Europe in terms of digital policies that we had in the last 20 years. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore that, well, it also caused a lot of confusion, and maybe other legislators can learn from it. And I think it's really key to think about more flexibility. I would agree with you, David, that it should, of course, count for any kind of business, but it has to provide flexibility and exemptions.
So maybe picking up on the idea of a bit of confusion and what Melissa was saying about the California privacy law. Obviously, that is passed. It's in a I guess more areas have to be defined and emerge. But how does that fit into this? I think Speaker Pelosi has made some comments about privacy law being as tough as or tougher than the California privacy law. So. Again, Ned and Melissa, is that the standard that everyone's going to follow, or is that going to be preempted? What's the?
Nothing unites business and members of Congress than a state moving out ahead of Congress. So, what I always say to folks is, don't try to wait this out. Be proactive, and small businesses, large corporations. Try to get involved in the game and don't think this is going to go away, because the unintended consequence will be a big disadvantage for businesses. Because as we saw with California, people generally want a level playing field, and having a patchwork system is never, especially in emerging technologies, the way to go. So I always recommend, get involved in the game. Don't wait until the house is on fire to go buy the fire insurance.
And I think from our perspective, obviously the California situation was really, it's an interesting case study for the poli-sci nerds among us. But in reality, I think it's very fair to say that there's a lot of things to learn from California, and having one national standard means that we're taking this seriously and want to take a look at how you really give folks the control that they want and they say that they need and would like to exercise, but also giving them all of those choices and innovations and loyalty programs and all the other things that we know that they love too. And a bill that was drafted and put together and passed and signed by the governor in about 7 days. There were some typos, like just little things that happened to us here in the best of circumstances. But I think that there's a couple different pieces where, especially when you get into the verification questions and the cybersecurity implications, we absolutely think that there's ways that we can provide that clarity and learn from what California's done and take that and really make a strong statement about how we, as a country, want to think through these privacy questions, how we want to think about innovation, and really fostering that in an environment where we have the First Amendment, we have public records laws, we have all of these different pieces, and like others have highlighted, I mean, we have a lot of privacy law in the United States that we need to think through as well. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can find agreement here, and it's a really interesting time, and I think one of the best reasons to be optimistic, but we need everyone to be engaged.
Well, optimistic. So to put words in all of your mouths, it sounds like you think a bipartisan bill in the 116th Congress is possible?
I think it's on the table.
We better hurry.
Yeah, that too.
Andrew? Andrew, do you want to participate in that prediction?
I think the Department of Commerce is working with all parts of the government to facilitate the information that any agency may need, or the House and Senate as well.
So I will follow up on your comment, you better hurry. For businesses, we're all hurriedly preparing to implement the California privacy law. So we would like Congress to hurry as well, so that we don't have 50 different regulatory or state statutes we have to deal with. So I will just echo that.
Well, I apologize, I have to run, but thank you all so much, and thank you, everybody. Please don't hesitate to reach out. The whole team knows how to get a hold of me, but thank you again, and we're open doors for feedback, so thank you.
Terrific, Melissa. Thank you so much. So I guess just picking up, and I'm sorry we're jumping around a little bit, but picking up what David talked about, which is can business handle multiple privacy regimes? And if so, how? Are there tools or models? I don't know if Ram or David or Oliver, you've advised your clients on this. Can businesses handle dealing with a California law, an APEC law, a GDPR law, etc.?
I would say that is one of the biggest challenges, actually, and that is something that is almost impossible to handle for small and medium-sized companies. And you don't even have to look at in other jurisdictions, because another disadvantage of the GDPR is that on the one hand side, it is a regulation, so it's directly applicable law, which is good. And the goal, of course, is to have a fully harmonized framework for data protection in Europe. But it provides for a huge number of so-called opening clauses. And one of the most important part in terms of data protection is how to deal with personal data of employees. And that is one of the very important part in every data processing agreement and in the practice for every business and every company. However, there is an exemption for HR data. The GDPR says this is up to the national level. It's up to the European member states to find national legislation about how to deal with HR data. And so this is challenging for European businesses, because they have to dig into the potential framework for this into every member state. And if you're working or providing services also in jurisdictions outside the European Union, the game doesn't get easier, right? And that's really, I think, one of the disadvantages. And in particular one, as I said, for small and medium-sized companies, they just can't handle this. This is extremely expensive and extremely complex.
Yeah, look, probably the single biggest threat to actually having privacy work worldwide is the threat of a fragmented implementation of various privacy regimes. You know, what is the point of having privacy that works inside of one jurisdiction and in another jurisdiction when the fundamental nature of the internet does not recognize jurisdictions, right? So the primary threat, the primary issue really, I think, that policymakers ought to think about is how do you build a system and how do you create rules and norms that ensure that from a business point of view, the implementation of these various regimes or different rules, that those can actually be harmonized, right? So I think there is a great deal of effort and thought that needs to go into that. But far and away for a business, The thing that is going to cripple businesses the most is not privacy regulations. The thing that is likely to cripple businesses the most is disparate implementation of privacy regulations so that I cannot talk to cPanel, even though both cPanel and Affiliates are complying to the same regime, to the same law, right? And especially if so that's just within one jurisdiction, but if you cross jurisdictions, it becomes a pretty significantly complex problem, right? So that's the threat part of it. Now, on the solution side, though, I think there are some fairly obvious, but also fairly reasonably well-defined solutions that are coming in place. I was talking earlier about this, the solution based on a technology called RDAP, and that solution, there is a model that has been put out that is agnostic about whether the authentication, validation is done by one party or by many parties. It is agnostic about whether the actual implementation is done in a centralized manner or if it is done in a distributed manner, right? But it's a framework. It's called the Technical Study Group Document 01, TSG 01. So if you Google TSG 01, you will see what that framework is. But what that actually tries to set out is a common model that has the promise of actually allowing for businesses to be able to implement to a single specification that has the configurable ability to say, the request is now coming from the United States, the request is now coming from Europe, or the data subject is European, or the data subject is American, so treat them differently. So long as you don't have to go and actually take the data that is sitting underneath in the databases and have to go transform the data. If you can keep the data in its state where it belongs, and you're able to apply a framework that has different filters applied, that can be applied to it, then I think there is a possibility of some sanity, through this system.
So I'll follow up here and just kind of agree with you and kind of disagree with you. And in my head, when I'm thinking about what you're suggesting, I can see my developers' heads exploding.
That happens every day.
Not the way it's happening in my head right now. So what I'm seeing is are having to develop a system that now says this data is coming from Europe, or more specifically, this data is coming from Germany, this data is coming from Argentina, and we're going to have these processing rules that now say, all right, in Argentina they have X, Y, and Z, so we're going to have to. That's insane. That is just insane, and I'm sure that that's not what you mean, because I'm just playing this out in my head in kind of a hypothetical way. Kind of what I see as a fundamental problem with this discussion is there seems to be a discussion that there's a European view of privacy, and there's an American view of privacy, and there's an Indian view of privacy, and an Argentinian view of privacy, and a Californian view of privacy, when really the discussion should be about what is it about our information that we want to keep confidential and private and be able to exercise rights around. Let's talk about those. At a higher level, at a government level, and at an international level, let's talk about what those aspects that are important to us. So as a result, you don't end up with this kind of weirdly complex system that nobody is going to be able to implement in a way that meets the needs of local jurisdictions, and you'll end up with nobody getting privacy, right? Then companies will just throw up their hands and say, you know what, I am located in, Argentina. I'm not going to comply with anybody else's law. Come sue me here and see if that works for you. That's just, that's a crazy thing. So I think that the discussion really needs to be removed from kind of these cultural stereotypes of, well, the Europeans are crazy, right? They have this right to be forgotten, and that's ridiculous, and we'll never be able to do that. Well, what does the right to be forgotten mean? What are people trying to get at? That's going to lead to a lot more understanding and better policymaking, I think.
Yeah, what makes my head hurt is the amount of profitability that companies have from the selling of people's personal data. And, that's the thing that's got consumers and the congressman's constituents most upset. And, if you can show me somebody that reads that privacy notice that comes in, they're a way better person. I can't find one that ever says, yeah, I read that, I look forward to receiving it. But, the profitability is you don't have people opting in. You have to get to opt out. And that speaks to what this whole situation is. Yes, information is being trafficked, but it's the privacy information that's the profitable component to this. And if people don't realize that, then they're way behind. And that's what's going to drive the move for regulation.
If I could come back, Frank, you asked how companies can or cannot comply with data protection laws around the world. And the fact is, as Ram said, we have one internet and almost 200 countries. And over 100 of those countries are in the process or already have data protection laws on the books. And those are disparate laws, so they require different amounts of compliance resources being dedicated to that. GDPR gets everyone's attention in 2018 because of the scope of the law. It's covering 500 million EU individuals, your potential customers, your supply chain, your vendors, but also because of the scope of the fines. The fact that a small company is going to have 4% of their global annual revenue potentially fined for a maximum misconduct is significant. For, 20 million euro or 4% of global annual revenue. So whichever is higher. So for large companies, it's more than $21 million. Recently in France, the French regulators fined 50 million euro. So that's getting everyone's attention. US companies alone, not the whole world, but US companies spend almost $7 billion on GDPR compliance. So if we have that replicated around the world, this is digital protectionism. It makes market access harder for those small companies who don't have the money available to penetrate this market or that market. So if we really want that free exchange and innovation and competition, we need to find ways of interoperability. And that's what Privacy Shield delivers to US organizations. And that includes German companies that have a subsidiary here in the United States. If they're working and sending EU personal data to their Tennessee office, that would require that they be subject to FTC enforcement here in the United States, and they're going to use Privacy Shield or send some other data transfer mechanism. So they could be using standard contractual clauses. They could be using binding corporate rules. But the Privacy Shield is a tremendously valuable tool that serves as a bridge between two different regulatory regimes. You mentioned the Asia-Pacific Economic Community, and in APEC we have another tool, the cross-border privacy rules. And this has been adopted by now 8 economies, the United States, Mexico, Canada, and others in Asia. An incredibly valuable tool, recognizing that, yes, Korea and Australia have different legal norms. Yes, Taiwan and Japan have different cultural norms about this, that, or the other. But we can find a common approach and provide that floor that we can then build upon. And it's a voluntary mechanism, so the best companies are going to use that to differentiate themselves from other companies that may not really take privacy as seriously or market that. And so the interoperability angle, I think is very, very helpful. And it does branch out to your vendors and in the EU parlance, the data processors who will be obligated by contract to carry forward those protections. And so it disseminates. And I think we're now getting to a more robust global discussion about what GDPR does or does not do right, how the United States can refine its approach. take the sectoral lessons that have been learned and move forward. So I do think that there's ways to control the cost that U.S. businesses and global businesses around the world are going to be spending on this.
If I may add, because I would absolutely agree, there is a lot of development in terms of legislative process worldwide currently. And it's interesting to see if you compare the different approaches and the different, well, laws or legislative processes, you will see that there are a lot of, well, common approaches actually. Every privacy or data protection regulation, more or less, is dealing with three mechanisms. One is transparency, one is accountability and the obligation to document your processes, and the third one is strong data subject rights. That are the core principles. And you find these principles in almost any legislation. And you have, at least from a European perspective, you have an interesting mechanism in order how to deal with other legal frameworks by these so-called adequacy decisions that the European Commission can carry out. If they say a country XYZ has a similar level of data protection as we have in Europe, then this is the easiest approval for international data transfer. We all know that unfortunately the US has not been recognized at such an adequate level. But I would have the hope that now that so many countries are working on their new legislation, that the European Commission will acknowledge a huge higher number in future as having an adequate level of data protection. And that would be a very comfortable and maybe the most elegant solution for legal international data transfers.
You know, my concern is that the small companies, small businesses are going to become part of a new privacy divide. And that is really because the burden of implementing this, morass of regulations from all around the world is so high a burden that, we were hearing about large companies who might have trouble, but small companies would basically be just out of the game. And you end up, instead of having a digital divide, you end up having a divide based on ability to implement these various rules. So I think not only is interoperability important, but adhering to the least number of burdensome principles, if you will. So not that the principles themselves are burdensome, but the implementation of them can be that way. So I think it's really important when policymakers get together from around the world to look at what are the things that are most essential that you can actually agree upon, rather than being nationalistic and say, I must have these 17 things always.
And I'll follow up. I seem to always be following up on you, which is great, because it's. But I like the idea of a framework, right? And that I think helps get us to Ram's interoperability, right? A framework of principles that helps consumers, essentially, we're talking mostly about consumers, get what they want in terms of private data, and allows us to build businesses that meet the needs of our customers. And that's what we want. Because to your point, Ram, we're going to end up with businesses in, again, using Argentina as an example, just saying, just come sue me, come find me, and their businesses will then be blocked elsewhere, and the internet will get fragmented, and that's a terrible thing.
We're going to go to Q&A in a moment if anybody has any questions from the audience. But so perhaps a final question. I think Ned and Andrew, I think you guys have mentioned during the panel that it would be very helpful for the ecosystem to talk to Congress. And I guess what would be, where are the areas that you think would be the most constructive? Is in what works, what doesn't work, what?
This is a technical field, and members of Congress are not always the most technologically savvy people. So what you want to do is you want to kind of give guidance to to where you can live with regulation and how this will not cripple the industry. And, I know there's probably a few that still want to put all the guys out of business, but that's not going to go anywhere. The idea is to craft legislation that people can live with that will still allow thriving innovation and profitability, but does address a uniform standard that people can live with, both on the consumer side and the industry side. And I think the earlier you make those contributions, the better chance that you'll have a final product that you can live with.
Something that I hear from U.S. businesses quite a bit is what they're doing already. And I think we are mistaken if we pretend that right now we're at year zero and something will just come. Companies are already taking this very seriously, and they have robust programs in place. It's just that there may not be a mandated system in place that is codified. And so I think U.S. businesses are coming already and saying, I'm doing X, Y, and Z because my customers have asked for this, that, and the other. I'm not doing this, which I know some Congress people have advocated, but here's why I don't think it makes sense. Let's look at an evidence-based system. What's probably going to deliver benefits to the customer, to society in general. This is what NIST is doing right now, talking through with terminological precision, with computer science experts and risk engineers. What is it that we're trying to achieve with data breach notification? Cybersecurity, you can have the most robust program in the world, you still may have a breach. It's not 100% guaranteed. You can have a great privacy program, and you might still have a privacy problem. But when that incident occurs in Europe, you go and talk to the regulator, and you show them your record. Your data protection officer, built into the GDPR, is going to walk them through and say, here's why I was doing everything that could be reasonably expected of me. To do more would have been a disproportionate effect. So this is a conversation that we all are going to be having with consumers, with businesses, with governments. And, I think on this last point, explaining the terms is so important. GDPR, very thoughtful, 20 years after the directive, so it's an enhancement of that 1995 directive. But even there, you have terms that, yes, legislators are not always the most technologically savvy. We understand that. We all have a role in influencing that language. So when you say state of the art, it's very good. It's broad, so it can be a living document. But if I'm going to be fined because I didn't have state of the art something, that's problematic. That's an open question. What is a disproportionate cost on notification? Is it $1 billion, $1 million, $10,000? So this was just the case, a GDPR enforcement in Poland. The organization had said that we had posted on our website that this is what our processing was. And the regulator said, I wish you would have mailed and notified them through official mail. The cost was perceived to be disproportionate. The regulator thought otherwise. So we're now having these conversations.
And if I may add, in addition to that, you have the problem that you have a huge number of different authorities in Europe with a different understanding on how they would have to enforce these new rules, which leads to another level of uncertainty for many companies. You mentioned Poland. The French regulator is very strict. The Irish still is more flexible. And you have a lot of different fines already carried out for completely different potential infringements of the regulation. And that's another level of uncertainty that is really problematic for many multi-jurisdictional companies.
I think that's where we really ought to look at. And if you look at what the eventual outcome ought to be, I think we ought to be looking at an outcome of a shared framework, not a common framework, but a shared framework that ensures interoperability and that allows for a focus on the minimum and most required principles to be shared across these various jurisdictions. That really ought to be where we need to end as an outcome. And along the way, I agree with some of the comments that have been made about getting more precision in defining what these terms mean. There was a comment made earlier about IP addresses maybe personally identifiable information. That may be true from a home router, but it may not be true if it is from in a large ISP that has a whole bunch of IP connections that are all muted in some way. So context matters in those areas.
I'd like to open up if there are any questions in the audience. Sure.
I've actually got a two-part question for Andrew.
Sorry, anybody else have any questions?
So I heard from the panel that we need a framework. Oh, thank you. Oh, that's great. I heard from the panel that we need a framework, and I'm extremely excited about what NIST is doing in building the NIST privacy framework. I actually think that the NIST cybersecurity framework and what was accomplished there, I2 Coalition was actually a contributor to that process, is one of the best things that we've done to address that complex issue. And there's a chance that we could do something similar in privacy there. So my question to Andrew is, how can organizations like ours and the businesses here best influence the decisions that come out of that process? And to Ned, I want to say, like you said very astutely, like there's a feeling that self-regulatory systems have failed. And so the question is, should I be that excited? Like, is this going to matter at all?
Sure. So I just think chronologically it makes sense to mention how companies around the world and individuals and other groups can help shape the NIST privacy framework. This is a fairly tried and true process that they follow. Like you mentioned, the 2014 cybersecurity framework has been widely adopted. Other governments around the world have formally said, we think this is a best practices document. And so in the United States, it's voluntary. Companies will run through that diagnostic and assessment themselves and say, here's where I have a gap analysis. I'm not doing absolutely the best that I could be in this aspect of cybersecurity. I want to get to this, or I have vendor obligations to get to that level. For privacy framework right now, the discussion is ongoing. So there was a request for input that has allowed for them to put together a draft document. You can go online at nist.gov and see that document. And then you can contact with follow-up. And now you're in this wonderful sweet spot where you give comments, but they're not legally obligated to post them to a website. So you can really tell them what you think. And this is a wonderful process. They want to hear from everyone. I can't stress that enough. They're very open-minded. And this is, to get everyone to use a common vocabulary, to understand what's being talked about, voluntarily pushing these best practices that I do believe there's so much time and energy being put into this because it can feed further discussions down the road if you do then move into a different political space.
Former Speaker of the House, Jim Wright of Texas, had a saying, don't tell me it can't be done, show me how it can be done. So rather than throw hands up saying, oh, this is too complicated or we're never going to get an agreement or get to the finish line, work in a collaborative manner. Every major piece of legislation that I've been around here for always had to have some refinements. The Telecommunications Act of 1996, people said, oh my goodness, this is going to be obsolete before it, gets signed. Well, it seems to have worked. I mean, there's been some refinements, obviously, that are needed, and technology has certainly sprinted ahead. But I don't think the idea here that this is so difficult is going to be an obstacle to actually getting something done.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Can I pass this around?
Well, terrific. Before I turn it over to David, I'd like to thank the panelists for the time this afternoon and their thoughtful comments.
All right, so just very briefly, on behalf of the I2 Coalition, thank you, everybody, for coming and spending part of your afternoon with us. I know that everybody's busy, and it's great to see so many people here. To Ned and Andrew, thank you very much for your time, because I know that is even more precious than a lot of ours is, and that your comments actually are great for us to hear. Just kind of to wrap up these privacy roundtables, one of the key issues for both the I2 Coalition and ECHO is to just emphasize how important privacy and particularly the US-EU Privacy Shield is to our organizations and to our member businesses. I am very aware of all the hard work that is going on in the EU to ensure that this mechanism still meets the needs of Europeans. And I'm also very aware of how committed the US government is to making this process work for our businesses and for our members. And so I'm very appreciative of the work that y'all are doing there. This is a continuing dialogue between the I2 Coalition and ECHO. We work together on a number of issues, not just related to privacy. We work quite closely on ICANN and IANA-related issues. So for those of you who are interested in domain names, which also makes people's heads explode, feel free to participate with us, and we'll provide bandages. But I think that there's a real opportunity here for the US and the EU, particularly businesses, to understand each other and help bridge what I think is sometimes a cultural divide between our business orientations. So I will give everybody 5 more minutes on their busy Wednesdays, and thank you all for coming.